To this meeting of the Standing Committee of the House of Commons pursuant to the motion that was passed by the committee on 20 January 2022. It is the duty of the committee to sit to consider the motion, and we will carry on according to the agreement that was agreed to beforehand. Those members who are attending in person and others who are attending in a hybrid format on Zoom will participate in this meeting. But they have to be very mindful of the fact that given the ongoing pandemic and in light of the recommendations of public health authorities, as well as the directives of the Board of Internal Economy in October 19, to remain healthy, I must remind you that anyone with symptoms should participate by Zoom and not attend the meeting in person. Everyone must maintain 2-meter physical distance while seated or standing. Everyone must wear a non-medical mask when circulating in the room. It is recommended in the strongest possible terms that you wear your mask at all times. And I, as chairman of the meeting, want to take this opportunity to thank the witnesses who will be with us today. First of all, Jeffrey B. Kukarski. I do apologize if I am mispronouncing your name, Professor, from Royal Roads University. Guy Saint-Jacques, former ambassador to Canada, the People's Republic of China. Wesley O'Rourke, a senior fellow for international government innovation. We also have Flavio Volpe from Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and Nicholas Tsaros from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is chair for energy and geopolitics. I will remind all witnesses that they have 5 minutes for opening remarks. And I would also like to take this opportunity to say that I will, at the end of the meeting, take 5 to 10 minutes to deal with and pass the report of the subcommittee of the steering committee. And therefore, I suggest that we begin now with Mr. Kukarski.
Good afternoon, honorable members. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you today. Lithium is on the list of 31 minerals Canada considers critical to the sustainable economic success of Canada and its allies, and position Canada as a leading mining nation. The Neo-Lithium takeover is not the first time a Canadian lithium company has been acquired by a Chinese firm. I have submitted several examples of Canadian lithium company acquisitions by Chinese firms over the past 3 or 4 years. The Chinese government's Made in China 2025 industrial policy seeks to make China dominant in global high-tech manufacturing, including in batteries, electric vehicles, and renewable energy technologies. The program's policy aims include mobilizing state-owned enterprises to acquire intellectual property, technologies, and assets abroad, with the overall aim to surpass Western countries. Securing access to lithium and other critical mineral reserves is essential to the achievement of Made in China 2025. I'm not arguing that this deal should have been denied because the lithium from this company would necessarily have been used in Canada. We currently don't have a lithium industry here to use it, but we never will if we allow all of our lithium companies to be sold off and don't have a strategy to build a supply chain at home. If we allow our lithium industry to be sold off, it also undermines efforts to support development of clean energy technologies that we will need for the clean energy transition. Part of the problem may be that government is assessing these acquisitions on a case-by-case basis, as the minister has said, each on their own merits, as it were. The problem with that is it seems to miss the big picture. This takeover is part of a broader pattern of acquisitions that Chinese companies have been making in this sector in Canada. How can Canada build a lithium supply chain, or any other critical mineral for that matter, when it allows the assets of Canadian companies to be acquired by a country that seeks to cement its dominance in this sector? If each deal is evaluated on an individual basis alone, without regard to what the past record of acquisitions has been or where we need to go as a country to build a strong supply chain over the long term, then how can we expect that we will ever be a player in this sector? I believe the government should review the national security review process and provide more extensive guidance on what types of investments and situations would automatically trigger national security reviews. For example, should acquisitions by state-owned or controlled companies, especially ones from China, be automatically subject to a national security review? There are also questions about the extent to which our national security review process is aligned with Canada's critical mineral strategies. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Kukarski. I will now turn it over to Mr. Saint-Jacques for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon, members of the committee, of the Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting me today. I will deal with the question at hand, but I will certainly answer questions in both official languages.
Economic development policy. Since the early 2000s, China has encouraged its state-owned companies to invest abroad to secure long-term supplies of oil and natural gas and minerals, including critical minerals. I would note that the majority of the some $90 billion invested by China in Canada is related to these commodities. And to be fair, I should add that many communities have benefited from these investments. As we heard previously also, China is pursuing a dual circulation strategy whereby it wants to become less dependent on foreign technology and products. And this is clearly the goal of the Made in China 2025 policy, which aims at increasing China's self-reliance in 10 key technological sectors, but also to become a net exporter of high technology. And as we have heard, this includes new vehicles, electric batteries, and renewable energy. This policy has increased the need to secure access to critical minerals, including lithium. To achieve these goals, China supports its state-owned enterprises by providing subsidies, tax breaks, cheap loans, and so on. We know also that it does not play by international trade rules. For instance, there is no level playing field for foreign companies in China, and many sectors remain closed to them or access is severely limited. China also uses trade as a weapon, as we saw after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Canada lost $4.5 billion in exports to China in 2019. More recently, Australia has been a victim of unjustified tariffs in 5 sectors because it asked for a full investigation on the origin of COVID-19. This being said, Canada is looked at by China as a reliable supplier of minerals. Our export to China in 2021 will likely have established a new record, as at the end of November, they were up 17.5% year on year to $26.6 billion, which is just $1.12 billion below the previous record established in 2018. This is thanks in large part to increased exports of metallurgical coal, copper, and iron ores. I would note also that many Chinese private mining companies are listed in Canada, as it is easier to raise money here than in China. Now, let me turn to the acquisition of Neo-Lithium by the Zijin Mining Group. The key question for me is, where is Neo-Lithium active? It has no mine in Canada, but one mine project in Argentina. I must say that it is not obvious to me to see how Canadian national security would be directly threatened by this acquisition. Also, we have a policy, a free market, and companies are allowed to manage their business as they wish. Should the government have been more concerned about this matter, about this acquisition, I think this raises a more general and important question. What is the policy of the Canadian government to support the production of critical minerals in Canada? And what concrete actions can be taken with our allies, for instance, under the US-led Energy Resource Governance Initiative or the Canada-US Critical Minerals Action Plan? That should be where we need more attention and more efforts. Thank you for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Saint-Jacques.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saint-Jacques. And now I will call on Mr. Warwick. 5 minutes.
Chair and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear in your important study of national security review and the acquisition of neolithium by a Chinese company, Zijin Mining. I'm going to skip over the timing and details of this transaction. I think they're familiar to the committee, but I'm happy to come back to them in questions. Really, to cut to the chase, the decision not to conduct a formal governor in council-approved national security review of this transaction was, I believe, a mistake. It is worth noting that the minister did not even take advantage of the extra 45-day period of scrutiny allowed under the Act to determine whether the Zijin takeover could be injurious to national security. The decision cannot be undone, but it seems to me this case offers important lessons for the conduct of national security review in future. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to lean forward to quickly identify 4 such lessons for the committee. The first regards strategic vision, which others testifying have referenced. In my view, national security review needs to be guided by a coherent economic security strategy for Canada. An economic security strategy remains under development, but it is not in place. There is also a promised critical mineral strategy, also not ready. The strategy will be important to address Canadian potentialities, especially with regard to northern development, to detail a Canadian approach to joint efforts with the United States, and to account for disturbing trends which we've heard about in global concentration of critical minerals processing, where China has established a very formidable lead, perhaps near monopoly. The absence of this strategic framework leaves the application of national security review under the Investment Canada Act in a state of confusion. Second point I'd make, translating policy intentions into action. The revised guidelines on national security review of investments issued on March 24th, 2021 state that all foreign investments by state-owned investors will be subject to enhanced scrutiny, and that the minister may take into account, quotes, the potential impact of the investment on critical minerals and critical mineral supply chains, unquotes. Lithium is included, of course, in the government's list of critical minerals. The ISED minister's mandate letter, published on December 16, 2021, contains multiple relevant directives, including the use of the Investment Canada Act, quote, to ensure the protection and development of our critical minerals, unquote. It calls for the creation of a critical minerals strategy. It talks about the promotion of economic security, the need to modernize the Investment Canada Act to strengthen national security review, and the safeguarding of intellectual property intensive businesses. But it seems to me that there are significant gaps between these recent policy statements and promises and their implementation, and these must be urgently addressed. Third point, conducting more national security reviews under the Section 25.3 provisions of the Investment Canada Act. The latest annual report of the ICA for 2019-20 shows that historically, that is going back to 2009, less than 1% of investment findings have been subject to an order under the Act. They are rare, but they shouldn't be, given especially the changing nature of threats to our economic security and the advantages more in-depth scrutiny bring. Any foreign direct investment with national security sensitivities, such as the neolithium case, should be subject to at least an additional 45-day review period as provided by Section 25.2 of the Act, so that a proper determination of the need for a full national security review could be made. Fourth and final point, enhanced transparency. The national security review process under the ICA is a secretive undertaking.
It is rare that Canadians learn anything about the reasons behind national security review decisions at any stage of the process. The explanations provided by the Parliamentary Secretary to this committee last week were, in my view, unconvincing and deserve to be subject to critical examination. As the neolithium decision suggests, greater transparency leads to contestability, which is valuable, and to the potential avoidance of poor outcomes and wrong thinking in the future. I would also add greater transparency reporting requirements for decisions on national security review would be in keeping with the government's national security transparency commitment announced in 2017. Finally, conclusion, Mr. Chair, national security review under the ICA urgently needs to be rethought to deliver greater economic security for Canada going forward. I believe the government addressed the neolithium acquisition using too narrow a framework, misjudged its significance to Canadian national and economic security now and in the future, failed to translate policy promises into action, and were caught up in a protracted period of political transition while the transaction was being reviewed, all of which I believe led to a wrong decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wark. I'll now turn the floor to Mr. Volpe for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to the chair and members for having me to this committee again. I'm very happy to be being preceded by my former professor at the University of Toronto, where one of my first lessons in international relations was the Taiwan Straits crisis, and that was the first, real foray into the U.S.-China balance of power dynamic. Here we are, almost 30 years later. We're here because of the dominance of that interplay on Canadian industrial and foreign policy, and more acutely on our critical minerals strategy. I think you invited me here because the world is electrifying, the transportation world, and where I represent $35 billion a year in shipments, 100,000 people employed, another 86,000 people employed by Canadian parts and system suppliers in the US and Mexico are central to this electrification and this dance between the major jurisdictions of the world and automotive manufacturers who are all in a race to get to a zero emissions future. If we're going to continue to be a major auto player in Canada, and right now we're the world's 10th biggest producer of automobiles, even though we do not have a Canadian automaker, we need to do two things. We need to be able to transition the companies that supply the current automakers in that $35 billion a year shipment to the new zero emission vehicle component supply chains. 30% of what is assembled in Canadian plants are traditional powertrains, internal combustion engines, and transmissions. We need to bet on those local companies making the transition to making motors and e-gears and batteries. And then on the battery end of it, we need to extract, process, and convert critical minerals into deployable components locally. Before this role and on this journey, between the first time I saw Professor Wark and this time, I taught international business at Humber. I practiced it in Canada as a country head of the biggest European renewable energies developer. Worked very closely with the Minister of Economic Development and International Trade provincially during a global financial crisis, and have been a key industry player in the two biggest trade negotiations Canada has partaken in the last 5 to 10 years, the TPP and the CUSMA. In all of these, China has been the biggest market disruptor, the elephant in the room, and the factor that we've needed to balance against opportunities we pursue as part of the US sphere. We're here because of the neolithium deal and the question of national security review. I'll leave the principles of national security review to experts there. I'll layer in our view on it from a components point of view. The assets are in a lithium mine, potential deployable assets are in a mine in Argentina. It's lithium carbonate versus the preferred lithium hydroxide. While we're not in production yet in Canada for cells that could go into batteries that are deployed into electric vehicles, well, we're not making those electric vehicles yet. And there is a real capacity coming online, we think, in the between 18 and 36 months, especially in the province of Quebec. Critical mineral strategies in automotive means local, local, local. We need extraction, we need processing, we need cell manufacture, and then we need battery assembly, because we all signed on in this country to the new CUSMA. And in that CUSMA, in the rules of origin, there is a regional value content equation that must be met for EV components and for batteries. And all of them are underpinned by local, local, local. None of that lithium or other critical materials can come from outside of North America and qualify for tariff-free export through the region. Canada does not. Canada's auto industry and its supplier industry does not benefit from sourcing lithium from outside of North America. And there's no profitable advantage to incurring the cost of importation. These are the highest cost components of the vehicle, both in terms of processing and assembly, and then also the biggest and most difficult products to move from their point of production to the final point of assembly. Furthermore, businesses rely on forecastable, stable regulatory behavior. Some in our business saw the potential for the blocking of this deal as blocking the sale of foreign assets.
Mr. Volpe, I'll have to ask you to conclude very shortly. We're out of
Sure.
time.
I've got 2 more sentences. Blocking foreign assets. There are many, many ways to do our part in combating China's increased dominance in this space. Picking a fight over assets on the other side of the world is not an action that our industry would recommend, given the current fragile nature of trade between our countries in automotive.
Thank you very much, Mr. Volpe. I'll now turn the floor to Mr. Tsavos for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for inviting me to address this committee. My name is Nikos Tsafos, and I hold the James Lester Chair for Geopolitics and Energy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I have spent my career at the intersection of energy and geopolitics, so I am grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the importance of critical minerals for the energy transition. I have 4 points that I'd like to leave you with. First, we cannot lower greenhouse gas emissions without critical minerals. These two go hand in hand. By some estimates, the global demand for critical minerals could increase 6-fold up to 2050. For some products like cobalt, nickel, and lithium, the forecasted growth is even greater. No matter what the actual numbers end up being, there is no doubt about the direction of travel. Based on current technologies, there is no pathway to decarbonization without more mining. Second, critical minerals will, over time, become more important than hydrocarbons. Today, the international trade in energy consists mostly of oil and gas. One day, the trade in critical minerals will supersede that trade in fossil fuels. The people like me who study energy security, who today look at the Middle East or Russia, will one day be looking at the lithium triangle in South America. They will focus on Australia and Chile, Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of Congo. We will need new mental maps to process and to think about this world. These global flows are going to create new linkages and dependencies. We can also expect them to create tension. Who can develop this resource? Who benefits from it? Who bears the costs? We can already see the fault lines of mining across the world, from Serbia to Bolivia, from Indonesia to Nevada here in the United States. This is a global story, but the politics and the tensions are local. Third, China has already built a commanding position in critical minerals. China produces some minerals, but its dominance really comes from the processing value part of the value chain. China is where commodities go to be turned into useful products. This capacity gives China and Chinese industry a competitive edge in many of the sectors that will be essential for the energy transition. We cannot talk about critical minerals without talking about China, which brings me to my fourth and final point. The West really needs a strategy for critical minerals. The end goal, as far as I can tell, is clear. We want adequate supply, produced responsibly, with a fair allocation of costs and benefits among companies, governments, and local populations. We also need supply chains that are resilient, not ones that run solely through China. There's a lot of work to do that, to grow supply, to build capacity, to strengthen governments. But the most important objective that we have is to ensure that Western companies have access to the minerals needed for the green economy. Supply chains without China are impossible, but supply chains dominated by China are unacceptable. Critical minerals and the industries they enable are too important to be left alone. Western governments should tackle these questions together because the stakes are too high for any other approach. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee and this important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsavos. So we now start our first round of questioning, starting for 6 minutes with Mr. Ed Fast, who's in person in Ottawa. So, Mr. Fast, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And my first question is to Dr. Wark. You've expressed serious concern about the government not following its stated policies. During the COVID pandemic, the government has supposedly beefed up its policies on protecting our supply of critical minerals and our access to critical minerals. Canada has also been working with the United States to establish a more coherent approach to the supply and the supply chains that deliver critical minerals to many of our industries, including automobiles. Do you believe the Neo-Lithium transaction is consistent with the minister's mandate letters or the policies that are currently in place to protect critical minerals?
Mr. Fast, thank you for the question, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to respond. I would say, and it's to repeat my testimony, that I don't find that the decision not to conduct a formal national security review was appropriate in the circumstances of this acquisition. The value of which has been reported in the media is close to $1 billion. And I would say in particular, it seems to me some of the guidelines that have already been set out by the government as to how they want to approach this issue, quite apart from promises made to create things like an economic security strategy, to beef up the resourcing of national security review, to create a critical mineral strategy. You know, these are all important promises, but as I said in my testimony, I think there's a significant and I fear perhaps widening gap between the promises and the delivery in reality. I would just in response to your question make one particular point, and it also references some of the other testimony the committee has heard. I don't regard it as terrifically significant to national security review that Neo-Lithium possessed a significant mine asset in Argentina and was engaged in a pilot plant project for extraction. I think it's very important, and this references my own comments about the need for a broader, more strategic, more future-oriented approach to national security review. I think it's very important to understand what's lost when we allow a Canadian company or a company at least that trades in Canada and is based in part in Canada to go into the hands of a Chinese SOE. We're losing future capabilities. We're losing intellectual property. We're losing technological know-how. We're losing an unknowable future, which I think all the witnesses that you've heard from will agree is going to be very important to Canada's economic development and to our transition to a green economy. And in that context, I think the narrowness of the approach apparently taken in this review process was fully on display and shown to be inappropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Kucharski, you mentioned that there are other transactions relating to lithium that have also occurred over the last 3-4 years. Are you aware of any of those undergoing a national security review?
Yes, I am aware of a few. I did some basic research into other acquisitions in the lithium space in Canada, and I came up with two or three examples, which I've included in my brief to the committee. I'm not aware yet of whether those underwent national security reviews. I couldn't find any reference to reviews being undertaken in those instances, but I'm not, currently in possession of all the facts on that. I'd actually like to look into that a little bit more.
Mr. Tsafos, you're from the United States, but I believe you have a keen interest in ensuring that the United States works with its allies to secure the supply of critical minerals for our key industries. Given the fact that this transaction was approved without a national security review, do you believe that that decision not to do national security was consistent with the understandings that the United States and Canadian governments have had about cooperation in this area?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As you pointed out, I live in the United States. I'm not a Canadian, so I will answer this from a certain distance. I think the key point that I would like to make is that the broader question here is, should we care who owns lithium and who produces lithium in the world? And I think over the last couple of years, especially in the United States, there's been a growing awareness that the indifference to that question, that not paying attention, has come at a huge cost. I will be very candid that Washington has not come up yet with a comprehensive strategy to address critical minerals and to safeguard them and to secure them. That's some of the work that we are trying to do as a think tank here in Washington. But in my view, what that strategy would entail would be to work with key allies like Canada, like Australia, like the European Union, in trying to think about how can these supply chains and evolve over time so that they become much, much more diversified than they are today from China. So that would be the strategic posture that I would expect from the United States. And we've seen various US institutions, including the Development Finance Corporation, give money to companies that are trying to diversify these supply chains. So that would be a core US objective to be pursued in partnership with allies like Canada.
So what you're saying is it really doesn't matter where these minerals are located.
This is a global market. The same way we think about oil, one place of the world, something happens, it affects us all. Over time, this is what is going to happen for these critical minerals. We may not see it today because they're a smaller part of the market, but that is where we're headed. And so the strategic question is, should we care about who owns this multi-$100 billion market and access to the critical minerals that will empower a dozen industries in the future? Should we care who controls those industries? And I think we should.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tsavos, Mr. Fast. That's all the time. We're a little overboard. I'll go. Je vais maintenant me diriger vers Monsieur Fillmore, suivi de Monsieur Lemire. Donc, Monsieur.
Now ask Mr. Fillmore to take the floor.
For making time today to share knowledge and perspective. It's greatly appreciated. I want to just to connect to something that Professors Kukarski and Wark mentioned about the guidelines for the ICA guidelines for national security review, and I'm happy to share that the guidelines were updated in early it was March of 2021. The new updates take into account the potential for the impact of investments and divestments on critical minerals. The changes also address concerns related to investments involving sensitive technology areas and critical minerals, and also investments by state-owned and even state-influenced investors. So the departmental review that was in fact conducted on the transaction had the benefit of these updates and changes, and in that context, the national security review was not triggered. So it wasn't. I think that's important to point out. But I will say that all members of this committee want Canada to make the most of our critical minerals, including having a strong presence in the transition to a green economy and the role that batteries are going to have in that transition. So that is, of course, why we're anxious to get to our critical minerals study that will then inform the critical minerals strategy. So we're all in a rush to get there. That study is waiting in the wings. But let's get to lithium now, if I could. And
Professor Kucharski, I think I would like to ask you to address two questions. I'll say that lithium is a specialty chemical or mineral that's tied to and tailored very specifically to the needs of consumers. It's different than a kind of a flexible commodity like iron ore, for example, that can take on so many different forms. Lithium hydroxide, as opposed to lithium carbonate or lithium brine, is the preferred form of lithium for electric vehicles. And case in point is Tesla currently building a lithium hydroxide refinery in Texas adjacent to its battery factory and will supply that exclusively with hard rock lithium. So the two questions are, do all lithium sources have the same strategic value to Canada? All lithium types have the same strategic value to Canada? And secondly, the way you look at this, is there any lever that, had the sale not occurred, that Canada could have controlled where these Argentinian miners mining lithium in Argentina were going to sell that? Could we have forced them to sell that in Canada? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. So I'm not a mining engineer, so I can't answer, specific technical questions on the differences between lithium hydroxide and lithium carbonate. But my general understanding, is that both of those inputs can be used and converted into the material used in lithium-ion batteries. And so I think we've heard that also from others on this panel. So I would then therefore consider them both as legitimate inputs to, electric battery production, and therefore are critical minerals and are subject to the scope of the legislation. Your second question, could you just quickly remind me your second question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the concern expressed around this transaction was that Canada is somehow giving up the usage of this lithium for Canadian purposes. The Canadian automobile industry, for example, that we've heard from one of the other witnesses. Do we have any lever to keep those minerals in Canada had we not let this transaction happen?
Yeah, I think the Professor Warwick also mentioned this, but it's not just the mere fact that the assets and the mine itself was in Argentina. And no, there is no way, I don't think, that Canada could or should compel the company to bring all of that production back to Canada. Of course not. However, this is part of a broader pattern. We've seen other Canadian lithium companies be acquired, perhaps not with national security reviews. We see the dominance of China in this space. We see the efforts of Canada and our partners and allies to strengthen critical minerals supply so that we aren't, reliant only on China, and we're not subject to economic coercion or other leverage applied by that country, which they have been known to do in the past, particularly against Japan back in 2010. So I think that, as part of a bigger story, what I'm saying is that, there are intellectual property issues, there is management knowledge, there is this company as part of a supply chain potentially that we now don't have any longer to help build our own supply chain here in Canada. And so maybe in the short term, we can't bring that lithium back to Canada. I don't know that for a fact. But companies like that are building blocks for building a supply chain. And so I think allowing those companies to pass a national security review seems odd to me. If you look at the bigger strategic picture and what we want to do over the longer term, it seems to me there were reasons why we could have reviewed that acquisition within more of a broader strategic context and building supply chains here in Canada.
Merci, Monsieur Kucharski. C'est tout le temps que vous avez.
Thank you. That's all the time you have, Mr. Fillmore. I will give the floor now to your colleague for 6 minutes. For Mr. Stavros, I have a question. From what I understand from your testimony, it seems that China has all kinds of critical material that is necessary for technology. Should Canada develop a common strategic technological plan that would allow us to develop our technology?
I think the short answer, thank you for the question, and Mr. Chair, the short answer is yes, where it makes sense. I think we're talking about a lot of technologies, we're talking about a lot of minerals. Some countries have them, some countries don't. Some countries have industrial competencies that others don't. So I don't think that the answer is everyone for themselves. I think we can benefit from trade and collaboration. But it does seem to me that having industrial competencies and serious supply chains that are not dominated or run exclusively through China is a worthwhile goal. As we argue here in the United States, that doesn't mean that everything has to be produced in the United States. But if you're going to be producing it overseas, you can do it with US investors, Canadian investors, other Western investors. So there are multiple ways to be involved in a supply chain that is not just domestic production.
So, in your opinion, should the Canadian government continue to support Canadian centers that send critical minerals outside of Canada? And should that support be extended to the value chain and to the supply chain? You've said that. I'd like to hear more.
Yeah, I can speak maybe a little bit from a U.S. perspective as well, because I think it speaks a little more to my experience. The major challenge with China right now is that they are a dominant part of the processing part, sort of the point where the mineral comes out and becomes something useful. So today, even in the United States or Canada, if you extract something, it may have to go to China to acquire value, right? So you have to think about your position throughout the value chain. And sometimes the extraction itself doesn't get you much diversification if there's only one buyer, and that's China, and you have to send all your commodities there, right? So I think it's important to think about the entire value chain, and that is where collaboration can happen. One country may have the minerals, another country may have capabilities to turn the mineral into useful product. A third country may have the final industries, whether it's automotive or batteries. That is the kind of collaboration that I think we need, but it has to think through the entire value chain. The extraction is just the beginning. That's not where most of the value is. Most of the value is in being able to access the mineral and turn it ultimately into a battery and electric vehicle in the case of lithium. The money is not really in the lithium. I mean, there is money in the lithium. The money is really on the final product.
And from what you've seen, do you believe that Canada has a national strategy or a vision with respect to critical minerals? Do we have that? Or what could the government of Canada do to promote a better vision, to put in place a national strategy that would be efficient and effective?
Thank you. I won't profess to critique or be an expert in the Canadian strategy on critical minerals, but what I will say is something that we've seen in a lot of places, not just the United States, which I know very well, and Europe, which I also know very well, is we have a tendency to think about the energy transition and trying to enable the final products that we want. So we want solar, we want wind, we want electric vehicles, but we neglect to think about the supply chains that will enable those final products. So we give a subsidy if you install a solar panel or a wind turbine or you buy an electric car, but we don't have the same amount of industrial focus to make sure that the rest of the chain is built in either the country or in allied countries. That, I think, has been a deficiency of multiple countries, with the exception of maybe Australia, which is a major producer of a lot of these critical minerals. And so I think that's one area of attention. The second area of attention, of course, is that finding the right balance between local populations, especially tribes and or First Nations in the case of Canada, Aboriginals in the case of Australia, finding that right balance between foreign investors, local communities, high environmental standards, that has been a trickier balancing act in the West than in some of the places that don't adhere maybe to the same kind of standards that we would like them to adhere to. That I think is another area for critical government work to try to make sure that we can raise standards, but not do so at the expense of ever producing anything, which is where sometimes we may end up.
Une dernière question en terminant.
One last question to finish. Do you believe that the amount of the transaction, about $1 billion, is a fair amount in your mind, or should it be changed with respect to what would be the threshold, say, for China?
I wouldn't pretend to have done due diligence on the project to be able to offer a fair price for the transaction. But what I will say is two things. One, lithium prices, if you look at the chart, they've gone up a lot. So what this transaction would be today versus 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago is very different. But I think the broader point is, look, the forecasts are talking about 30, 40, 50, 60 time increases in these critical minerals. For lithium, the International Energy Agency thinks the increase might be 100-fold. When you grow a market 100-fold, right, it's very difficult to understand today what that market is going to look like. We're talking an enormous amount of value, and we're also talking about developing resources in a lot of places where we don't think it's economic now. If you have to grow something 100 times, you have to go to those resources that are not economic now. And so the value changes over time. We've seen this with hydrocarbons. We're going to see the same thing with critical minerals.
Thank you, Mr. Tsavos. Merci, Monsieur Lemire. On passe maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Mr. Massey, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses. 17 years ago, I asked this committee to look at this issue because China Minmetals was spending $7 billion to buy up Noranda. Then Prime Minister Paul Martin thought it was a good idea. It was the first state-owned enterprise to do such a thing. Then Industry Minister David Emerson showed some reservations to it, but then later on backed off. We've had other incidents since then, and it's just kind of gone and focused on China. But what I had raised was, at the time, concerns even of our private equity firms and other unknown purchasers. And so my first question is to Mr. Work and Mr. Kucharski. Should we not be looking also at some type of transparency there, or at least some review, and how do we deal with that? Because you have co-investors even from, and what I had, I didn't even focus particularly just on China. It was non-democratic governments that were purchasing Canadian companies and have been. And what we've seen is successive governments raise the threshold over and over again for triggering reviews. And at the same time, the danger we have right now, in my opinion, is also losing startups without any reviews or screens that are smaller in the money allocated. And during all this, it's just ironic that we're doing this because of electric vehicles and the concerns related to that. And if I go back in time, like I said there, it was unacceptable for Canadians to own even shares in Petro-Canada for our vehicles at that time, as we sold it off. And then you fast forward today, we even had to buy pipelines. So, I mean, here we are again, dealing with auto and the consequences of transportation on this. But I'd like to know is it should be opening up a little bit more robust than just focusing on China alone. Mr. Work and then Mr. Kucharski, please.
Mr. Mass, thank you for the question, Chair. I'll just say that I think probably government officials may agree with you in questions tomorrow that the national security review process needs to be more robust. It is probably not resourced to the extent that it needs to be. Intelligence assessments on these foreign direct investments are very difficult and take time, and we certainly need to work with allies to think through them, which is one of the reasons why I am so struck by the fact that the government was so confident that it didn't need to even invoke the second 45-day period that's available to it before it goes to a full national security review. I would also just like to take up your point about losing startups, because I think this is very significant, not least in the critical mineral industry. And what we are losing with regard to the Chinese takeover of Neo-Lithium at a pretty extraordinary price tag is a startup. Neo-Lithium is a junior miner with this project in Argentina that is a kind of pilot project, a pilot plant extraction effort. They recognized, and it's clear in the company's own transactional documents, that they needed more capital or a partner to be able to really bring this asset online. And they found that partner in a Chinese mining company. Not in a Western one. And I think it is important, and it should have been important to National Security Review to reflect on that fact and on the significance of losing a startup capacity, which is not just about a mine asset in Argentina. It is about, as I said, technological know-how, intellectual property, and about the future. And we have cut ourselves off from that by failing to think through these issues more significantly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Czarkarski.
Yeah, I would build on that by saying that in this case, the company that's doing the acquisition, Zijin Mining, is a state-controlled company, and that should have automatically triggered a national security review, in my view. And I would tend to focus, in terms of the legislation, the guidelines, mostly on state-owned enterprises, whether they're from China or anywhere else, but particularly from China because of China's dominance in critical minerals, but also because China has used that dominance, not only in critical minerals, but, demand in its own economy to exert coercion and leverage over other countries. So we have a specific concern with China's behavior. So I think that, as I said in my opening statement, I think that state-owned enterprises or state-controlled firms, particularly those from China, should automatically trigger national security reviews. And certainly in this case, one should have been conducted, in my own view. And we know that, state-owned and state-controlled enterprises have unfair advantages over private firms like Canadian firms who have to compete in the marketplace for capital. They have access to cheap capital. They have access to subsidies. They are under the influence of the government and the regime, which has its own strategic priorities and therefore can influence how those assets are employed. So I think for a number of reasons, that's justifiable. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to get Mr. Volpe into this. Mr. Volpe, you had some really good testimony. I think it's probably some of the most pertinent with regards to when you look at the practical application of what we're faced here. As you mentioned that we've actually slipped to 10th in the world in auto manufacturing. I remember the days of being at number 3. And then as well, we don't have the domestic decision makers like we used to. We don't even have many CEOs. They used to have Canadian CEOs for some of the companies that were here. Some of them were trained in Canada later on and became CEOs in the United States and other places. And I guess where our auto industry is going could be, I guess one of the positions of getting out of just the trans missions, as the traditionals that you've mentioned that is still very much dominant, having, I guess, not being, or having a greater strategy than just rip and ship. So having lithium and the others as part of our positioning to get investment. How important is that to have a policy where it's not just rip and ship these resources out to other automakers across the globe, let alone the United States? It could be Mexico, it could be Europe, it could be China, and whatever. How important is it for us to have a solid domestic policy, not to rip and ship?
Mr. Massé, I'm sorry, we're already about a minute extended on your time for questioning, but I'm sure we'll have the chance to get back to this important question for Mr. Volpe on your next round of questioning. If you don't mind.
I'll leave that for Mr. Volpe for next question. So just let me know, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Donc, on est prêt à passer à deuxième.
We're about to go on the second 5-minute round. Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Wark. BNN Bloomberg last week pointed out to Canadians that Canadian investment funds were amassing $148 million, were sending rather $148 million abroad. This is reflective of a multitude of a complete variety of resources that are leaving the country. How can you explain that foreign countries want to invest in our mineral industry here in Canada rather than Canadians wanting to do so?
À qui adressez-vous votre question, monsieur?
Your question is for whom? Mr. Wark. Mr. Wark.
Merci, thank you, Chair. I'll just answer very briefly, and I'm not an economist, but I think what you've heard from other witnesses today is that Canada, like many other countries, has been slow to think about the value chain involved in critical minerals and a transition to a green economy. We are hopefully trying to catch up. Part of the business of catching up is to create a made in Canada capacity to identify critical mineral source locations, to extract minerals, to process them, to feed them into global supply chains. But at the moment, we are nowhere there with regard to lithium, which is, I think, regarded by many as a critical mineral. We have other strengths in other more traditional mineral extraction, but we haven't yet headed in the direction of being able to create that made in Canada capacity, which can feed into a global marketplace to Canada's benefit. Allowing a junior miner with a significant kind of experimental project in Argentina, as I'll call it, to slip into the hands of the Chinese, it seems to me is an indication of a legacy policy where we have not properly thought about our capacity to build a made in Canada knowledge and capabilities in the new economy when it comes to critical minerals. And you know, that is the direction that we need to go. Whenever we see a critical mineral strategy being produced by Natural Resources Canada, that should be an important question directed at that strategy. Hopefully it's going to be embedded very strongly in it, but we haven't seen that critical mineral strategy as yet.
Merci, Dr. Wark.
Thank you, Dr. Wark. I'm going to continue. You were very, very critical of the government in your presentation, which you felt should have been far more exhaustive in its approach to this matter. The neolithium mine was acquired by a Chinese company, but there was, in fact, mitigating circumstances. It wasn't just mishandled by the government. There were elections that were held, and there was quite a period of days, 45 days, when the government was not sitting. So how can you put things in place, would you say, so the government could carry out that review in the time frame?
Mr. General, thank you again. And Chair, I'll just answer as quickly as I can. I believe that the political transition period we were in probably had an impact on the kind of attention that we should have been given, particularly at the political level, to this transaction. But I would also say that one of the reasons why I think that we need to do more national security review, or at least do reviews of sensitive acquisitions using the full 90-day period provided by the Investment Canada Act, is that the acquisition of information and intelligence and the analysis of it and consulting with allies and coming up with proper judgments is a difficult, complex, and time-consuming business. And we need to have the resources and the talent to do that business, and we need to give it time. I am really, to be honest, I'm afraid, dumbfounded by the fact that the government was so confident about its conclusions within that 45-day period from the original announcement of the acquisition in October through to early December that it felt it didn't even have to do any more. And you know, that I think we just have to reflect on this acquisition and say, you know, rushing to judgment on these matters where there is a strategic issue clearly involved, sensitivities clearly involved, Canada's future economic security clearly involved. We must take our time to do this, and I'm afraid we didn't take the proper time. I'm not trying to prejudge what a national security review conclusion might have been. I'm just saying we needed to take more time and give this much more serious attention than was done. And the kinds of explanations that have been offered by the government to date, I find wholly unsatisfactory and very narrowly focused.
Thank you, Mr. Warg. Merci, Monsieur Généreux. C'est tout le temps que vous aviez.
That's all the time you have, Mr. Généreux. 5 minutes now.
Monsieur.
Mr. Erskine Smith, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joel. So I'm sympathetic, Mr. Kucharski, to what you said around state-owned enterprises. The committee, in recommendations in the last session, unanimously recommended that where a state-owned or controlled enterprise was involved, that there be an automatic national security review. Also sympathetic to this idea of a broader strategy rather than taking it case by case, and certainly sympathetic to the idea that we have to be especially cautious where countries have weaponized trade in the past. But when I get to the nuts and bolts of this one, I just want to be clear on the details. And so, Mr. Volpe, just so I'm clear on what your testimony was, you had said location matters, and you said local, local, local. That's correct?
100%. And let me just expand on this. We're doing a lot of, kind of navel gazing, I think, on what is the potential for the use of lithium from Argentina. I practice this every day. I was part of the CUSMA rewrite. We cannot use lithium from Argentina in production of vehicles in Canada, US, or Mexico and meet the CUSMA USMCA compliance rules of origin. So we're talking about a hypothetical use here that in practice would never happen.
I appreciate, and just, sorry, limited time, but
sure.
Just to build off of that, location matters, the kind of lithium matters too?
Absolutely, the type of lithium matters, and all auto companies and part suppliers are in the business of who can build the longest lasting, longest range battery. So the chemistry is important, and the specific recipe by each company is important to listen to. If the companies say they won't use it, they're not going to use it.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Wark, it's good to see you again. Last time I think we engaged one another, we were setting up a national security committee that has recently been deconstructed, unfortunately. But when we look at this particular transaction, I'm not so sure, based on what Mr. Volpe said, that it clearly touches our economic security. It depends really what the critical mineral strategy is, I think, and depends upon location, depends upon the kind of lithium, and depends upon how we can add value, to Mr. Safos's point, into the supply chain and what role Canada is going to play. But it may well be the case, and so I do take the point around the need for a broader strategy. But in this particular case, I think you've said that the main criticism is more time should have been taken, and we should have been more thoughtful and clearer about the strategy here. And I guess my question is, what more did we need to know? So we know the kind of lithium and that it's less strategic. We've got location does matter, is the evidence from Mr. Volpe at least. We know that it's a publicly traded company, although it is a major shareholder, is a state-controlled enterprise. What more do we need to know to make this decision, I guess? If the national security agencies on an enhanced review are saying no need to proceed further, and we'll hear more tomorrow or Friday, I think, on that particular question, but to help me ask those questions when we get the experts in, or the officials in, I should say, what more should have been asked? What more should we know?
Mr. Erskine Smith, nice to have the opportunity to converse again. Nice to see you, Chair. I'll just respond very quickly, in part by addressing, in a way, Mr. Erskine Smith's suggestion that we knew all we needed to know, and the government had made a decision appropriately on no national security review. I think it's very contested that lithium carbonate is a less important derivative of lithium than lithium hydroxide. It's certainly contested in the Neolithium corporate documents. It's contested certainly in some of the public expert discussions about the future of lithium carbonate and its uses. And I would note that the Neolithium pilot plant project in Argentina was producing lithium carbonate at what they described as a 99% purity level for use in batteries. So again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that the black and white notion that government has advanced that lithium carbonate is of no strategic value, which I think was the suggestion from Mr. Fillmore, is probably
I appreciate
incorrect.
that. I guess it sounds though then you're bleeding into an argument sort of as to why it ought not to have been approved at all, as opposed to this idea of more time. I guess I was trying to get clarity as why more time. But so, sorry, just I apologize, just limited time. My last question was for Mr. Safos, just in relation to the broader strategy. So we're dealing with this one transaction, but this is a much bigger picture issue of how does Canada and the United States work together with allies to have a more resilient supply chain, I think is the language that you used. And so what's the advice to this committee if we're going to make recommendations to the government about how Canada can work constructively with our allies, including the Americans, to build out more resilient supply chains, keeping in mind the evidence from Mr. Volpe in particular?
And I would ask for a brief answer, Mr. Tsavos, please.
A brief answer on how to solve this problem. Thank you. Mr. Chair, very quickly, I would say, one, we need, I think, a better infrastructure of information. You know, when something happens in the oil market and the gas market, we've been doing this for a long time. We know what it means. These are new markets where policymakers, elected officials, it's not as easy to understand what they mean. I think that's one. Number two is, I think we really need to figure out how we put public money to support the supply chains that we want, not just to put money at the final product. I think that's a key part. And the third thing is I think we need to have a much more honest conversation about exactly what you're talking about, which is what is the ultimate threshold at which we say no, right? And if we treat every transaction one by one, we say, well, this is not going to tilt the thing, this is not going to tilt the thing, this is not going to tilt the thing. And then you wake up one day and China has 80% of the market, right? So we need, I think, a much more coordinated approach of what we want this thing to look like.
Thank you, Mr. Tsavos. Merci, Monsieur Erskine-Smith. Je passerai maintenant.
I will give the floor to Mr. Lemire, 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. My question will be for Mr. Wark. First of all, thank you for your testimony. You mentioned that only 1% of Canadian businesses, through Canadian foreign businesses, have been subject to a national security review. Is that concerning to you? And do you think that there should, what is the effect of the national security review on Canadian security?
Monsieur, merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question.
Very quickly, I'll say that I think it's widely regarded that national security review is an important tool that the government has to try and protect Canada's national security, including its economic security. We haven't quite yet come to a definition of what we mean by economic security, which I think is important. And I think, as I said in my testimony, I think that there should be a much greater willingness going forward because of changes to geopolitics, because of changes to the global economy, a much greater willingness to use the full national security review provisions and to use them in a strategic context where we're not thinking, as Mr. Savos says, on a kind of one-by-one basis, and we suddenly find that a great deal has been slipped away. And I would also say that the notion that we do national security review with a purely local internal focus, I think simply is wrong. Whatever local might mean to the Canadian parts manufacturing industry, I understand. It has very much less significance to the question of Canadian national security, it seems to me, and I think that needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Moi, un des enjeux que je...
There are issues that I find very important, and one of them is transparency. Should the government, do you think, be more transparent and set out the criteria that it based its decisions on in terms of the context of national security reviews?
Again, merci, Monsieur Lemire. I would just say, Chair, absolutely. I think there is a requirement for greater transparency. really for two purposes, three purposes, if you like. One for in the general kind of public interest, so that Canadians better understand how the government is using this tool. One for accountability, particularly in the part of Parliament, and we're seeing this in action now. One for the investor community, and I think, frankly, and I think those in the investment community will say there's been a lot of complaint and confusion about the guidelines and how they're implemented, and I think greater transparency around that would help all of those sectors: parliamentary accountability, public knowledge, the investor community, to better understand what's involved. And I see no reason why we couldn't come up with an appropriate degree of greater transparency around these decisions that are made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Merci, Monsieur Lemire. Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Mr. Massé.
Mr. Chair, and quickly over to Mr. Volpe to be able to get in on this. And real quickly, how do we, as Canadian assets in terms of our minerals, leverage that for further auto investment? I'm worried about the fact we haven't had greenfield expansion as others have, and would like your comments on how do we use this as an opportunity to expand our manufacturing base.
Thank you. By definition, these assets aren't Canadian. As it pertains to how we source parts that are compliant in the trade agreements that we have. So nothing we would have brought in, if it actually was profitable, which it isn't, from this potential mine in Argentina would have furthered that. What we need to do is our critical mineral strategy has to be around the extraction and processing of those critical minerals here in Canada. I am the committee chair of Invest in Canada and battery development in the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. You've been to those meetings, Brian, over the years. It is federal government, provincial government in Ontario and Quebec, and the assemblers, the part suppliers, and academia and labor. And this is where we have these big overarching policy discussions and creation. Mr. Fast, of course, sat at that table for years. We do have a strategy with regards to critical minerals, with regards to battery creation and assembly, and location here in Canada. And I'm sorry, but I'm not hearing any of that in the contemplations here about the theoretical national security interest we may have in stuff in the ground in Argentina. What we need to do is what we are doing, and that is pursuing these major investments, creating the future market draw, auto assemblers, battery assemblers, who then have to meet the CUSMA compliance rules of origin and source that stuff in Quebec. We know in the industry, orders are being made for that 18, 36, 72 months off. At the same time, they were actually ramping up this production of electric vehicles. For us in the industry, I know here we're having a discussion about, could we have had more time? Should we have done a national security review? But it sounds to me like the arguments are about, look, let's predetermine an outcome. We're invested in the fact that we think this was a national security mistake, when in reality, practically thinking, what is it? Where is it? Could we actually use it? If we could use it, would it be profitable? There's zero risk here. And this is akin, in my estimation, of risking a holding penalty on someone who's passed you on offense, and then maybe the ref will see it or maybe you're not, just to frustrate the opposition. We have to do more important things, like work on our mining potential and extraction potential in Canada, especially Quebec, because it's there.
Okay, thank you. And I know Mr. Chair was over last time, so thank you for that.
And again this time, but that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Volpe. Thank you, Mr. Massé. Donc, maintenant, on passe à Madame.
Now we'll move on to Madame Grade from the Conservative Party.
Much, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. My first few questions are for Dr. Wark. You illustrated the timeline of the purchase of neolithium, with it being made public in early October 2021. And in your remarks, you mentioned that a protracted period of political transition may have played a role in the acquisition not getting the needed scrutiny. But by this, are you referring to the recent snap election? Is that what you're referring to in that comment?
Sorry, thank you for the question, Chair. I would just say we'll probably all remember the timelines of the recent election, which had been concluded by the time that this transaction was announced and notified to ISED. the problem was in the post-election period, where a new government is creating a new cabinet, where departments and agencies are responding to transition briefings and focusing on transition briefings, where new cabinet ministers or returning cabinet ministers are provided with mandate letters. That is the political transition period that I'm really talking about. And how does that detract from national security review? Well, departments and agencies continue to do their work, but perhaps their attention couldn't be fully paid to this issue. Perhaps they couldn't fully get the attention of cabinet ministers who had not yet been appointed. Perhaps their attention was elsewhere. They were rushing through, I think, entirely unnecessarily initial 45-day period without giving any thought to a second 45-day period. And I should say, just to explain the technicalities, the committee is not familiar with them, to engage in a second 45-day period under the Investment Canada Act requires an exchange of letters between the Public Safety Minister and the ISED Minister. And so it involves them, obviously, in a clear briefing and consideration of the file, which, given that we didn't go into that second 45-day period, may never have taken place. So I think it had some kind of impact. Difficult to know what. The timing at the very least was unfortunate for the kind of extended scrutiny that I think this takeover required.
Great, thank you. That's good information, and thank you for clarifying that. The next question that I have is, this same committee had studied the Investment Canada Act and potential changes back in the summer of 2021 and submitted a report with recommendations to Parliament. Now, one of the recommendations that was made, I'll just read it here, was that the Government of Canada introduce legislation amending the Investment Canada Act to reduce the current valuation threshold for prospective acquisition of control by either state-owned or state-controlled enterprises to zero, so that every transaction triggers a review, including a net benefit test and a national security test. From a security standpoint, should the federal government have implemented such a recommendation?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say, and just remind the committee that the net benefit test, which has different thresholds depending on the kind of transaction we're talking about, is quite separate from the national security review process. Although, perhaps in an ideal world, they should be more closely combined, and maybe an economic security strategy would think about that. But the fact of the matter is that national security review, at its various phases, is meant to be conducted no matter what the threshold of the investment, and was conducted in this case. So, as interesting as the suggestion from the committee might have been, it doesn't really, I don't think, apply to national security review.
Great, thank you. And we know that the Investment Canada Act, the recommendations were brought to Parliament in 2021, but the actual work was done back in 2020, just for clarification. Now, I wanted to ask you, the government is using language of security screening being done, but no comprehensive review. Can you explain the difference between security screening and a review? And would a screening be sufficient based on your expertise, Doctor?
Again, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would just say, really, to try and put the Investment Canada Act process in a nutshell, there are three phases. There's an initial phase of national security review, which must take place within a 45-day period from the notification of the investment. And that initial phase can then be followed, which is designed to raise questions about, does this investment pose any potential national security risk? The language that government officials use is, could this investment be injurious to national security? After that initial 45-day period, the Investment Canada Act allows for another 45-day period, an additional 45-day period, to continue to scrutinize an investment under that same kind of heading of, could this investment be injurious to national security? What triggers that under Section 25(2) is an exchange of letters between the Public Safety Minister and the ISED Minister. At the end of that potential two-phase process, then the ISED Minister, in consultation with the Public Safety Minister, needs to decide whether to go to a full national security review, which can provide the agencies with much greater time to scrutinize an investment and ultimately come up with a determination of whether an investment would be injurious to national security review. So that is, I hope that is helpful. There is a could be injurious phase and there is a would be injurious phase, which is ultimately determined through formal national security review.
Thank you, Mr. Warwick. Thank you, Madam Gray. That's all the time we have. I'll turn to Mr. Dong for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for coming today. My first question is to Mr. Volpe, and just by listening to your testimony, I'm a little surprised to find that currently in Canada, we don't have any auto manufacturing that producing EV batteries. You said it's going to take another 18 to 36 months?
That's right. It's also about the demand to date. And regardless of our ambitions, the market demand is about 3%. And those production decisions are made by Japanese and American companies that make vehicles here in Canada.
And what kind of recommendation this committee can give to the government so we can ensure the industry has lead in some specific technology or be ready to take a significant share of the market?
We have a volume of an enviable volume of critical minerals in the ground here in Canada. We have the upstream companies that could do the battery assembly, companies like Martin Rea, that is JV'd with a company called Nano Explore to do a battery company, Volta Explore in Quebec. They need processing help, and we need to address directly the Canadian mining industry. Who owns the mines? Who owns the resources here for extraction?
We have a lot of resources here.
We got a lot of resources here. We don't have the capital currently deployed to take those resources, process them, turn them into cells. And currently working with governments at both levels and in Quebec and Ontario on deploying that capital or that capital strategy here to get there.
Thank you. My second question is to Mr. Sappos. So we have experts in the lithium market suggest that lithium supply for the North American market will trend towards North American mines and plants. What are the security and supply chain benefits for North American sources over a dependency on foreign sources?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. I, as a student of energy security, we've learned over many years that, local supply chains, local production has certain advantages from international supply chains. There's, fewer linkages, there's less exposure to effects that may happen far, far away. But to be intellectually honest, I would say that, concentration in one place at home is also a risky thing. So really, resilience is the objective. It's not just domestic supply. If you produced everything at home, but it all came from one part of the country that could be subject to something happening, then you're out of production, right? So there's a benefit to domestic. You control it. You know what's happening. You have rules and regulations. You have oversight. You have tools to incentivize more supply. All these things are great benefits. But really, the solution we've learned from history is diversification, resilience, redundancy. And if you have that, domestic supply is an added benefit, I think, but it is not a cure-all.
Thank you. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have 1.5 minutes.
That's great. My third question is for Professor Krajewski. So with the minerals for electric batteries being so critical, should we stop, you say all transactions or most of transactions, regardless the type of mineral deposits, and the roles in critical Canadian supply chain and the nature of Canadian business and actual location of the mining deposit. Should we stop all transactions?
Thank you for the question. No, I'm not saying that we should stop all transactions at all. What I'm saying is that I believe that an acquisition, a proposed acquisition by a state-owned or state-controlled company should automatically trigger a national security review. I'm not saying anything about what the end result of that review would or should be. I'm just saying I think we need to review the review process and ensure that state-owned enterprises are given due, scrutiny over such transactions.
So any principle in that review? I'm just thinking again, as for recommendation to the government from the committee, any specific principle of those reviews or specific elements of should be included in those reviews? Do you have any suggestion for the committee?
Yeah, I think I would just say that that the government should consider making a national security review mandatory if the company doing the acquiring is a state-owned or state-controlled foreign company.
Or even if. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Dong. That's all your time. I'll now go to Mr. Krem for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Dr. Wark, can you just explain in lay terms why a Chinese state-owned enterprise would want to acquire yet another lithium supplier when they already refine 80% of the world's lithium?
Thank you for the question. It's a fascinating question, probably best directed in a way at Zijin Mining. I would say that, which is the company that has acquired Neolithium for a $1 billion price tag. One of the things that's interesting about Zijin Mining, if you look at the company's corporate history, is that it began as a gold miner in China. It expanded overseas, principally in gold and other base metal extractions. The Neolithium takeover by Zijin, to the best of my knowledge from the available public documentation on Zijin, is the first such acquisition that it's made. And I'm presuming, I can't speak for the company's directors and owners and whatever passes for shareholders in a Chinese SOE context. I'm presuming that they looked at, and they did do their due diligence on the Argentinian mine, which is recorded in the Neolithium public documents on the transaction. I'm presuming simply that they looked at that asset, thought about the future, thought about how they wanted to position themselves as a global miner, and as a potential future Chinese industrial champion, as the Chinese strategy has it, and thought that that was a terrifically important acquisition for them. The question for me, I must say, is if we're going to think about foreign direct investment in a national security and economic security strategy, we also have to do what is in intelligence terms known as a net assessment, which essentially means you think about your own interest in this investment, and you also think about why is a foreign company also interested in this investment? And I hope, and perhaps this is a question for officials when they appear tomorrow, I hope some due consideration was given to that very question, which I think is implicit in your question. Thank you.
And again, with Dr. Wark, if this is clearly part of their long-term strategy, can you think of any good reason why this would not trigger a national security review on our end?
I'm afraid, Sir and Chair, I cannot think of any good reason. And that's not to prejudge the outcome of a national security review, but it is to say that this was a sensitive acquisition on political and economic terms that needed, I think, really considered judgment, not a rush to judgment in a 45-day period.
Okay. And Dr. Wark, in your presentation, you mentioned that less than 1% of investment filings have been subject to a national security review. And also in the ICA report, it was pointed out that the majority of these reviews involved acquisitions by Chinese entities. So I have a two-part question. Why are so few national security reviews done? And why, of the ones that are done, is China so overrepresented?
Thank you for the question. Excellent question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you as to why we have failed to do very many national security reviews in the past. I think the best answer I can give to that is that it wasn't part of the tradition. It wasn't part of the way in which we thought about foreign direct investment. We wanted to maintain an image for Canada as a country open to foreign direct investment, which we saw as important to our economic prosperity. And although that still holds, but what has changed is the geopolitical and economic security environment in which we now operate. So whatever our past calculations in that regard, I think we have to, take a different approach in future. And it is also, I must say, to be fair to officials involved, it is a resource-intensive and very complex undertaking to come up with an appropriate intelligence assessment on these investments. And I think, to be frank, Canada has not invested a lot of resources in what I would call economic intelligence. That hasn't been a priority for our intelligence community. We may need to pivot to that enterprise, more appropriately in the future. But I don't think we have a lot of resources that we can devote to that at the moment.
Okay. Still with Dr. Wark, in June of last year, the White House released a report entitled Building Resilient Supply Chains, Revitalizing American Manufacturing and Fostering Broad-Based Growth. And this report states that global demand for lithium, one of the most important inputs in electric vehicles, is estimated to grow by more than 4,000% by 2040. And the report goes on to say that the United States must secure reliable and sustainable supplies of critical minerals and metals to ensure resilience across U.S. manufacturing and defense needs. And so if Canada loses its lithium supplies, can you elaborate on what this means for lost opportunities given the integration of Canadian and American supply chains?
Mr. Crum, I'm afraid we'll have to come back to that for that answer in the next round for the Conservatives because we're out of time. So we'll go right to Madame Lapointe for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Is for Mr. Tsafos. You talked about that on this matter, most of the value is in being able to access the lithium. Can you deepen my understanding of what is meant by that?
Of course, Mr. Chair. The way I think of it is, you progressively go from the raw materials to something processed. You then turn this into a battery pack. The battery pack goes into a vehicle, and ultimately you make a lot of money on the vehicle, right? So there's value that accrues throughout the chain, right? And so I think the question that we have here, the question that the United States faces, that Canada faces, is, where do you enter into the chain so that you can create value on your own, right? So if China controls the first 4 parts of the chain, and then they just sell you a battery and you just put it in the car, then a lot of the value that is in that battery essentially accrues to China, right? So what I meant is that if you look at the numbers, and in my testimony, it'll have, I quote, Bloomberg NEF, one of the well-known energy consultants, and they show kind of like the value of the lithium that may start at $11 billion, the mined lithium ultimately ends up in a $7 trillion auto industry, right? So the lithium itself has value, but the question is, who can access that lithium and turn it into a useful product? That's where the competitive edge comes from. And if this was an open market and you could get lithium wherever you wanted, who cares, right? But this is not an open market. It's a new market. It's a growing market. So accessing that mineral is very important in ways that it's not for other commodities where there's ample supply. You can go get it from the open market.
Thank you. My next question is directed to Mr. Volpe. It's been said that it's very important to think about the whole value chain. Can you weigh in and share your thoughts on that, and in particular what that means for Canada?
Sure, I think the concept is minds to mobility here. I'd say if we're going to take what we do in automotive, internal combustion engined predominantly vehicles that are made in platforms that are shared around the world. And around the world, we're going to shift, both from a regulatory standpoint to mandating zero-emission vehicle market percentages, to industrial policy. Like, I know we're all talking about China's centrally planned, state-owned enterprises. But the Americans, by most definitions, are going by the way of industrial policy in this space as well, spending billions on different parts of this value chain. It also matters for every country that is in the automotive business, at least, how will you compete? And so the transition, which is in part being regulated and then in other parts being co-invested by our competitive jurisdictions, is to move to zero emissions that requires critical minerals and to the deployment of high voltage platforms that will enable artificial intelligence, machine learning, connected autonomous technologies. For Canada, as the 10th biggest manufacturer in the world that makes 2% of the world's vehicles and does not have a car maker, an OEM, we have to concentrate on where we do play. We play massively in the parts space. We play massively in the technology space. And many independent studies from around the world have always ranked Canada as one of the potential key players in those critical minerals. For us, it's where do we play? Canadian lithium, like Canadian cobalt and Canadian graphite and all the other critical minerals we need to define what that is. It's Canadian if we can find it in Canada. It's not Canadian in the deployment sense, in a regulatory compliance sense, if it's overseas. And that's especially true because successive Canadian governments have entered us into successive trade agreements that define what products are by country of origin. And so the strategy here is to say, where can we play? And Canada can play on the technology side, especially the mobility technology, is absolutely playing in the volume parts, the added value volume parts, and has the potential to surpass some of the other players in that top 10 group by being one of the key players, 3, 4, 5 players in battery manufacture. That comes down to, can you extract lithium in Canada, process it in Canada, turn it into cells, turn it into batteries that go into electric vehicle platforms that are made in Canada that are then enabled by Canadian connected, autonomous, intelligent technology.
Thank you, Mr. Volpe.
You're welcome.
Do I have...
Merci, Madame Lapointe. Malheureusement, c'est tout le temps.
Unfortunately, your time has expired. Madame Lapointe, Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Volpe, for your presentation. I'd just like to look into it more. You talked about the local strategy and its advantages. Is it good to have processing in physically located close to where you extract the minerals here in Canada and in Quebec?
From a profitability point of view, it's almost necessary. And you're talking about big sums of materials being processed to make smaller sums of usable components, and they're big and they don't transport easily or cheaply. And the global auto business is based on just-in-time delivery. And so car companies try to take the biggest components and locate their sources close to where their final assembly is. Quebec and to a large degree Ontario are very well positioned to be profitable contributors to that space. And we signed on to a USMCA or CUSMA that says actually they have to be sourced within North America to qualify.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Saint-Jacques. When China, which is the largest supplier in critical minerals in the world, it is acquiring other sources of minerals other than lithium. And when they acquire a company like Neolithium, is it strategic or is it just business?
Monsieur Lemire, je ne vois pas.
I don't see Mr. Saint-Jacques here. I think we're having some connectivity problems here. Yes, I noted that. Well, I'm going to ask another question then. Well, maybe somebody could answer the question that I just asked. If you're interested in doing so, is it just a business interest or strategic interest on the part of China?
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer quickly, and other witnesses may have their own views if that's appropriate.
Sure. Briefly, though, because we're almost out of time. So
okay, very quickly, I would say that in the Chinese context, I think it's important to understand it's almost impossible to distinguish purely business calculations from state strategy and state policy. China is a very different economy with a very different political structure than is the case for Western capitalist societies, if you like. So you can probe the details of what is strategic and what is economic in their investments and policies, but very difficult to distinguish broadly between the two.
Thank you, Mr. Wark. And now the floor is for Brian Massey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Volpe again, just yesterday, General Motors announced another $4 billion in Orion. I can get in my car here and drive an hour from here to Lansing, Michigan, where they're getting a new battery plant of $2.6 billion investment. They also did $150 million recently in New York State for electric parts. What are we like? We're getting our lunch eaten. This is really bad in terms of the investment decisions. How do we turn this around using our critical minerals to make sure that we actually do get the value added here? It's been very robust for Michigan and Detroit in particular over the last several years. How do we turn that around so we just don't become susceptible to losing not only within, I guess, Argentina, which is you've shown is not connected to this at all, but for other manufacturing that we see on our doorstep right next to me.
Brian, you're certainly a champion for your region, and we've always spent time agreeing on a lot of things. I will recast your question with, what do you think they were thinking in Michigan when the year before we landed $6 billion of investments in electric vehicles and battery manufacturing in Windsor, Oakville, and in Woodstock? I think you're right. We are competing with Michigan more than we're competing with anything south of the equator. We do have to be vigilant on pieces like that. And part of the Canadian equation and part of the reason why those companies committed to manufacturing those vehicles here is because they see the long-term strategy includes real resources that are extractable and processable here in Canada. If we don't, like you said, if we don't stay on it, like we have been on it, the American industrial policy, the Biden administration's investment, a dedication of almost $200 billion into the space, will lead to us losing more than we win. But I'll remind you also that any vehicle assembled in Michigan also includes 30 to 40% parts made in Ontario. So it's not always a binary announcement for Canadian parts suppliers.
No, I know, and they do actually go back and forth. So I don't disagree with that. But I mean, let's be real here in terms of Detroit has overperformed all of Canada for auto investment over the last number of years. That's just the raw numbers, and this is we're disproportionately dropping, especially on OEM manufacturing, to our trade numbers where we did the sell. So you're right. There's some really good news and there's some stuff happening, but I want more. So that's.
I'll agree with you there. I want more too.
No, fair enough. And thank you.
We'll end on that note of agreement. Thank you, Mr. Volpe, Mr. Massey. We'll turn for 5 minutes to Mr. Fast.
Well, thank you very much. I want to return to a comment that Mr. Fillmore made, which is reinforced by Mr. Erskine Smith, and that somehow lithium carbonate is effectively useless for the EV battery industry. And that's just patently false. If it's battery grade, it is highly useful, so much so that a Chinese company is paying $1 billion for it. And I would note that Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, which is the world's leading reporting agency and market intelligence publisher for the lithium-ion battery industry, said this, as reported in Reuters: prices of lithium carbonate in China jumped to a record high in December, driven by strong demand from manufacturers of the batteries that power electric vehicles. That's from BMI, the industry reporting agency. So it's pretty clear that the Chinese knew what they were picking up here. Now, I'm going to go back to Dr. Wark. I was intrigued by a comment you made. You said government explanations for not doing a national security review are wholly unsatisfactory, end quote. I hope I got that quote right. Could you expand on that?
Mr. Fast, thank you, Chair. I'll just quickly provide an answer and hopefully accurately reflect on what the parliamentary secretary said to the committee yesterday, and presumably you'll hear more of the same tomorrow from the minister and his officials. First of all, there was the point made that this was lithium carbonate production in the pilot project that Neolithium was running in Argentina, not lithium hydroxide, and so it was irrelevant, which has been very much contested, including in your remarks and in remarks by other experts. Secondly, there was the notion that this was really an Argentinian mine. It was an offshore resource, and so it was hard for the government to see its relevance to Canadian national security. Those kinds of considerations, it seems to me, have also been raised by Mr. Volpe in his remarks. But I would just reference the fact that I think that everyone involved in this conversation about critical minerals in particular is in agreement that Canada needs to up its game in terms of creating a critical mineral industry capacity and a lithium capacity in Canada, which we currently don't have. It's very hard to see how you're going to do that by allowing a Chinese company to take over a very promising development by a Canadian company in terms of technology, know-how, and intellectual property. And who knows what the future might be. I think Mr. Volpe himself mentioned the word potential. And it seems to me that has to be part of any national security review. It seems we didn't, I don't think, give any consideration to the future potentiality of this company in terms of its previous track record and how that might apply to Mr. Volpe's determination that the only thing that matters is local, local, local. Well, we don't know what the future of Neolithium might be in terms of its future ability and its future activities in Canada. But apparently we just ruled that out because at the moment it had an overseas asset. And I think I think those were the main points that the parliamentary secretary had made to my understanding, and I find it hard to believe that they really hold water unless we had engaged in a much fuller review and consideration, including, as I said, Mr. Fast, I think it's very important to think strategically, to think long term, to understand the complexities of these transactions, and also to apply what I call a net assessment approach. That is, you take what your interests are and you consider them, you take what the interests of a foreign direct investor might be as a strategic calculation, and you combine both. I don't think we gave sufficient thought to why it mattered that a Chinese FSOE was acquiring this asset.
Thank you. How much time do I have, Chair?
You have 45 seconds, Mr.
All right, a quick question to Mr. Tsafos. How much lithium is being produced in the United States today? Do you know?
I do not know the answer to that question. Sorry. Off the top of my head.
It's my understanding there's not a lot of lithium being mined in the U.S. There's none being mined in Canada. And yet we've got Mr. Volpe suggesting that because we would source it outside of the CUSMA partners, that somehow that's going to be offside with our rules of origin. And he and I can probably contest that, but I don't want to spend more time on that. You also said, what is the ultimate threshold at which we say no? It was your rhetorical question. What is the ultimate threshold at which we say no? Do you have an answer to your own question?
Very briefly, Mr. Tsafos.
Mr. Tsafos.
Oh, sorry, this was for me. By the way, very briefly, I did look it up while you asked. The U.S. Does not publish the number for lithium. It's withheld for confidentiality reasons, but it's very small. I think the threshold, the way I would think of it, is we have a lot of well-established tools that we've used in other industries about industry concentration, diversification, measuring the share of the top 3, the top 5 suppliers. We have a lot of different ways to think about criticality in this sector, especially as we look to a rapidly growing sector. So I think you can't look at a resource today and say, well, it's not material, because frankly, every resource that we have is going to have to expand tremendously over the next 10, 20 years. So we need to apply a little bit more imagination to visualize what this world is going to look like. We can't just look at 2022 and prejudge too much the importance of these assets for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Tsavos. That's all the time we have. And now for our last questioner, we have Mr. Gahir, sorry.
Hi, thank you, Chair. My questions are for Mr. Volpe. Firstly, so Neolithium's own November 2021 feasibility study observed that battery cell manufacturers are planning capacity investments closer to where the automotive manufacturers are located within North America or Europe. So is this preferred by the Canadian industry that battery cell manufacturers are planning to stay close to auto manufacturers?
It's just a function of the way the business runs. You don't increase costs by putting your biggest components so far away that you'd eat your profit in transporting them. And then number two, Mr. Fast plays fast and loose with rules of origin, but he and I spent a lot of time around the table at the TPP in those negotiations. And those rules of origins are in place for a reason. Defines what that asset is in terms of tariff eligibility, and you want it close to Mr. Gahir because it then becomes defined as North American, and you don't have to charge a tariff as you try to sell that vehicle into a really tough market.
Yeah. So in line with what you're saying, the same study suggests that local lithium sources in North America are preferred by manufacturers because it cuts down on lead time and freight costs and it minimizes default risk. And these are increasingly important given the limited shelf life of lithium hydroxide. Do you agree that with the assessment that local lithium hydroxide from hard rock resources is what will be critical to North American manufacturers and battery manufacturers?
Well, forget my opinion, and why don't we look at the investment decisions of the major automakers in North America who are committing to generational investments in battery electric vehicle production throughout North America, including Mr. Massey pointing out very close in Michigan. There are no lithium deposits in Michigan. They're all north of Michigan. So why do you want to make cars in Michigan? Well, I mean, you want to be close to that capacity. And despite the fact that Professor Work doesn't like the word local, the fact of the matter is on the ground, this is how those investment decisions are made. And this is why Mr. Massey is saying we have to be careful and we've got to watch out that the Americans don't eat our lunch, because the Americans are obsessed with local. In fact, they've invested hundreds of billions of dollars into local because their customers are local. And so a lot of this theory that we're looking at in terms of what could be there for a national security review doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens tested in the market, and who drives the market. And right now, the American consumer drives the market, the American government drives the market, and we serve it in Canada.
Yeah. So my last question is, it's brought up based on something that Mr. Work said. If it's so economically infeasible for Canada to access this resource for the purposes that we need it for, why would China be interested? Because geographically, they would be just as far, if not farther away from Argentina.
Mr. Safos has alluded to it. There is a great interplay on energy resources around the world, and our reliance on the types of critical minerals that underpin batteries and their deployment, both in transportation and in utility, as well as other places, and overlays really well with China's global ambitions. And China's global ambitions in Central America and South America are the subject of many public studies. And so their investments in infrastructure in those regions would probably benefit from the acquisition of a lithium mine there, and also the export and foreign direct investment objectives of Chinese auto into those regions that have less disposable income that could accommodate Chinese produced vehicles at lower costs with lower customer expectations of range and durability that makes that lithium more viable in Argentina than it does in New York or Ontario or, for that matter, in Coahuila.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gahir. So that concludes the time we had for questions. I wish to thank all the witnesses on behalf of the committee for taking the time to speak to us this afternoon. It's much appreciated. So thank you very much for that. And we might hear from you again in the future. And before we adjourn, I'd just like to ask the members to stay on for a few more minutes. There's a bit of committee business we need to take care of. And that is, I want to adopt I'm hoping that the committee wishes to adopt the subcommittee report that's been distributed by the clerk. I was promised that everyone was on board, so I hope that's still the case. Oh no, I see Mr. Harrison Smith with his hands up.
Rather than oh no, to be especially collegial, I'll just say I move that the committee adopt the subcommittee motion and that we proceed with the schedule we've set out there.
Okay, so Mr. Lemire. Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire? Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to say, and perhaps I should have mentioned it a little earlier on, that the version was sent to the members of the subcommittee, but I'd like motion number 4 and also point number 3 to be included. That is to say, to address the issue of processing, of transformation. It's one of the issues I think really is very central. I think that should be integrated into point 3 of question 4. So as far as the rest is concerned, I'm happy to adopt it. I'm looking around the room, rather, Mr. Lemire. Nobody seems to be objecting. Mr. Clark, I seek your advice. Can we proceed in this way? Yes. Well, all right. Then silence is golden, and I thank all the members of the committee. Thank you for today's meeting.
Merci à tout le monde. Merci au